Hey ceramic students, welcome back to the studio. This week we're going to work on our ocarinas, or a stone flute. This one has 4 holes that I've drilled in it, and it's tuned. The ones that we'll practice will be maybe slightly less complicated than that, depends on how much work you want to put into it, but before we do anything in terms of sculpting the clay, we have to design some tools. So let's take a close look at these things and see what we have to do to get them shaped up. So the tools that we're going to have to design first are these 3 chisel tip tools. And they may actually look a little bit familiar to you at first, but the reason that we're going to need them is we're going to have to do a fairly precise bit of carving in order to sculpt and shape this part of the ocarina here. We'll call it the voicing or the window. So there's a fair amount of delicate carving that has to go on inside of that to make it sing. And in order to get that, you'll need at least 3 different sizes of chisel tip tool. If I hold them in profile, you see that they not only taper in sort of on the front facing view, but they also taper from the side view. That's going to help sculpt the voice box and the airway to get there. So how do we get to these sort of things? Well, remember that the first tool that we made this semester just sort of had a blade edge on one side and maybe a chisel tip on the other. And what you've got to work with in order to get that kind of thing are a couple different thicknesses of popsicle stick and a bit of sandpaper. Now, you may have some other tools laying around that might be helpful. I'll demonstrate a few things that could be really handy, but for your wider fipple sticks, for your wider tools, you're going to need the full-size popsicle stick, and then for the skinnier ones, you can use one of these stirring sticks, these coughing stirring sticks. I would recommend at least designing yourself 3. One that's about the full thickness of the popsicle stick itself, one that's slightly thinner, and then a really nice thin one. And we'll use these as sort of like stair steps to kind of ream the opening open. Now, when I'm doing this project over the last couple of years, I've designed a couple of different sizes here that sort of fit in between those. I actually probably have 4 or 5 different size sticks depending on the size of the voicing and the size of the airway that I'm trying to make. But for what we're working on for this project, let's keep it fairly straightforward. Let's go with 3 basic sticks. And basically what you need to do is get one end squared off so that you can start shaping that chisel tip end. Now, I suppose if you have no other tools around, you could just sort of snap this thing in half and work with the straight edge that you're left with. You may get something that's not quite straight though, so if you happen to have maybe a pliers with a cable breaker on the back, one that's designed for cutting wire, you could just sort of cut your square end that way. Just kind of load that into the cable breaker toward the back and watch where this piece flies. Okay, and just by cutting off that rounded tip, you'll actually kind of get yourself started so that you can actually start to work the tip down on the sandpaper. If you happen to have an X-Acto blade or utility knife, you might get a little bit cleaner cut. The way that you would work that would be to maybe if you happen to have a straight edge around. Straight edge could be back of a ruler or anything. Kind of lay this across the back of the popsicle stick, and you don't even necessarily have to cut all the way through the popsicle stick. Just kind of get it a good score line and then snap it in opposition, and that works really well too to kind of cut a nice straight line. If you're not opposed to doing a little bit of carving, you could save yourself some sanding time by sort of carving the tip down just a little bit. If you don't mind the sandpaper I gave you is 120 grit sandpaper, and you'll just kind of slowly work that tip down until your chisel tip is shaped more and more. Now, the tip that I'm working on right now, it's pretty abrupt. It comes to a very sharp point. I find that the longer that taper is, the sort of smoother that transition from full thickness to thin, the easier it works. So basically what you're going to have to do is, with the sandpaper, right, lower the angle of your sand so that you're able to sort of shave down the sides more, so that you're removing more material here. So try to get your stick here to be even, so that looks like more or less an even thickness all across the top. Now what I would like to work on is a taper that runs the long way, so that my Fipple stick not only is sort of thinning when I hold it in profile, but it's starting to get a little bit thinner toward the tip. What might be easiest is for you to take a pencil and sort of mark some lines on this thing. So with these lines as guides, you'll have something to aim for. And any straight edge will do. I'll actually just use the side of one of my other popsicle sticks. So these pencil lines give me something to aim for a final thickness. So I'll sand right up to that line and then flip to the other side. So in general, the 120 sandpaper that I've handed out to you guys is probably going to be good enough, but if you happen to have anything else laying around, like for example, I have some 220 sandpaper, which is a much finer grit, and I'll work that over the same piece, and this will sort of take off any rough edges, maybe help polish the surface of that clay, or surface of the wood. Anything that's going to make that sort of cut and slice through the clay a little bit easier will be handy. So I will, on my own tools, typically work with maybe a 120 grit to shape the tools, a 220 grit to sort of fine-tune the edges, and then in a second I may use polishing sandpaper to really polish down the edges. So now that's a much smoother tool. I've knocked off any of the hard edges, and then if I happen to have it, a polishing emery cloth or a piece of polishing sandpaper, 400 to 600 grit, 8,000 grit, somewhere in there to like really give it a polish. That will allow that tool to cut more firmly or nicely through the clay, and will allow a nice clean opening so that the clay on the inside of the voicing is nice and clean as you're working to polish that. Any sort of small textures or kind of bumps, grooves, inconsistencies in the clay on the inside of the airway or the voicing is going to change that sound, and if you want a nice clean sounding ocarina, you need a nice clean airway. So keep working your tools down until they're nice and smooth, nice and sharp, and you have 3 basic sizes, small, medium, and large, and then we'll pick up with the next section of the tutorial with the clay. So we'll need to carefully move your previous tile piece out of the way. Be careful moving this thing around because at this point, if yours is like mine, it's probably in that dried mud stage and it's incredibly fragile. So I recommend having another flat surface nearby and just transferring that onto the flat surface. And hopefully we'll be able to fire these things before the end of the semester and make them a little bit more durable. We're going to need some clay out, and also you're going to need to get the slip jar that you produced a couple weeks ago. Now if your slip has started to dry out, you may have to add a little bit more water to it and sort of stir it up, but basically the consistency you're looking for should be roughly the same consistency as like mayonnaise or ketchup or sriracha, or choose your condiment, right? But basically just kind of like, it's not so runny that it falls off your finger, but it should be pretty liquidy. And it can be recycled. You can throw old scraps of clay in there too and it'll just dissolve. If you accidentally goofed and left your slip uncovered, remember that all we did was we took some dried clay, smashed it up, and added water to it. Pretty straightforward. We'll need some slip pretty soon in the sculpting process, though. So don't start working your ocarina without some slip nearby. Grab your clay block and the wire tool that you made earlier this semester. And since our first ocarina is really just going to be a bit of a practice piece, we're just going to try to master that first sort of difficult bit of carving, the voicing and the airway. We're just essentially trying to get a piece of clay that will sing. So the amount of clay that we need for this project is fairly small, something like maybe somewhere between a sort of golf ball and a baseball size. Something about like that. Don't forget to wrap up your clay and keep that away from the air so that we don't accidentally dry it out. So hand wedge this piece of clay. Essentially what we're going to do is pinch out a void to begin. So remember that hand wedging the clay sort of wakes up the clay particles a little bit, makes them more malleable, it homogenizes the clay, it gets rid of any cracks that are on the outside. It's just a really great idea. So do yourself a little bit of a favor and cut off one end of your ball here. We're going to need a little bit of clay for a second piece later on. And let's use this bit of clay here to sort of pinch out a little bit of a void. And the amount of clay you have in your hand here will just determine how big of a piece you have left over. I'm going to make this just a little bit smaller. I'll make a real small ocarina at first. And we're going to take this right back to the beginning of the semester where we made a pinched vessel or pinch pot. Essentially we're going to hand build an open void. The idea being that this half will be the void and this part here will be a cap that we score and slip onto the outside. It'll be kind of handy to keep a little bit of water close by because as you're pinching here it's nice to sort of keep the clay hydrated. The water that you're using behaves a little bit like oil in an engine. The thickness of the walls here is a little bit up to you. It doesn't have to be super thick or super thin. I think that pinky thickness rule of thumb is not a bad one to go by. The smaller the ocarina, the sort of sweeter the sounds. You probably want a nice thin-walled piece. If it gets a little bit too difficult to sort of work with or carve, those thin pieces though really kind of depends on your final design. I'm going to go for sort of a thin-walled piece here, and because the clay I'm working with is sort of a little bit of wet stoneware, I got to be careful not to go too thin too fast. But remember that the pinch potting technique that we use is just kind of like a woodpecker, pop, 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 and sort of pinching with my hand, and I'm slowly starting to bring this wall closed so that the form starts to become an open void. Okay, so that's not bad. Essentially now I need a matching piece that I can sort of put on the front side. This opening is pretty large. I might try to sort of close that down a little bit when it's a little bit drier. But the piece that I'm going to make to match on the opposite side should be about the same diameter here and about the same thickness. So set this guy aside to dry, and we'll kind of come back to it when it's just a little bit, when it's stiffened up just a little bit. And we'll work on this guy. So those two pieces are pretty close to their matching up size, but now I need to wait until those have stiffened up a little bit. So if you have a fan, you can put these pieces in front of the fan, give it a few minutes, or if you want to go have some lunch and come back in 15-20 minutes in the open air, that sounds about like the right amount of time for where we are in the country. It really depends on the humidity in your space. I wouldn't recommend leaving these things unattended for very long though, because they will stiffen up in a hurry. So I'm going to put those guys face down on the canvas board, sort of true up some of their sizes, maybe kind of tap out any last minute sort of shapes here just to kind of get those things drying in about the right direction. And we'll come back and continue shaping those pieces later. Once the two halves of your ocarina body have sort of stiffened up a little bit, you may have the opportunity to sort of thin out those walls a little bit more, and then we're going to score and slip these together. Instead of waiting any longer, I'm going to use a blow dryer or a heat gun to sort of set these things up a little bit. Be really careful with this technique, as these pieces can get away from you really quickly, especially the thinner they get. But I'll come back to that using that blow dryer or heat gun in order to set the clay a little bit more later on. Now, the best idea here would be to make sure that I score all the way around the edges, but we don't have a scoring tool. The scoring tools we have access to at school are these serrated ribs that are able to sort of scratch up the edges and give you a really nice kind of quick scratched or scored edge. But what if you don't have a tool like this? Well, you could make one. If you happen to have an old credit card or plastic ID card sitting around and you want to kind of carefully notch the edges with scissors or a knife, that could work really, really well. For this bond, because my clay is still really, really wet, I think instead of using a scoring tool, I could probably just get away with one of the edges of my Fipple sticks and just carefully sort of notch each one of these edges. So this is the technique that I would recommend if you don't have anything else. Now honestly, a fork would work, a stiff paintbrush, anything that has the ability to sort of chop up or break the edge or serrate the edge of your clay. Now I need to get these two attached using a layer of slip that goes in between. If you happen to have an old paintbrush laying around, you could easily kind of dip a paintbrush in here just like we do at school, but a finger works just as well. We don't need to gob this in, we just need a little bit of good slip in between, and as you're dabbing it onto the seam here, make sure you're not flattening out all those nice score marks that you just made. Now this is going to be the last time that we see the inside of your ocarina, and so it's probably not a bad idea to get a sponge with a bit of water and just smooth out any kind of rough spots that you might have put in with a finger mark while you were still working. A nice smooth inside for your ocarina will give the tone a little bit smoother sound. Now these two edges can be sealed up and carefully blended together. So this piece, as I seal this seam over, will be blended completely so that that seam is completely gone. And what we've got is a fully enclosed air gap on the inside. So with the piece all sealed up and smoothed over, we can do a lot more work to the outside later on, so don't sweat it if there's a lot of small marks on here, but there's a lot of different ways that we could have ended up with a hollow form. I like the pinch potting technique because it's fairly simple, right? With really basic tools, we can go with it. If you happen to have, a scoring tool and a smoothing rib, awesome. But even if you just made your own tools out of some popsicle sticks and made your own slip, it's pretty straightforward. What we can do then is to start shaping the ocarina into whatever shape you're really looking for, and then we're going to add a mouthpiece onto the front here. Now the mouthpiece that I'm going to add, I'll just use a piece of this scrap clay that I had still left over from the original design. And I'm going to sort of have it come off the front and be a little bit thicker on the back side and a little thinner toward the front. There's really no particular shape that this needs to be, so long as it's wide enough that when I push the Fipple sticks into the clay, it's wide enough that a full width of your popsicle stick can fit through. Now, I'm going to attach this mouthpiece sort of roughly onto the front here, and eventually I'll do a whole lot more shaping and shading, but it's mostly important that I get this clay onto the main body of the ocarina while it's still wet. And I can pretty much put this mouthpiece wherever I'm looking for, but I'm going to try to design this ocarina to follow the design of the handouts that I'm giving you. So the mouthpiece will sort of be up high on the piece, and then the belly of the chamber will be back here. If you happen to have your scoring rib, go ahead and score the two pieces. Otherwise, scratch them up really well with one of the other handmade tools that you've got. And then blend that mouthpiece in so that it looks like it was always there. Now that will likely be a little bit more clay than I need, but I kind of want you to imagine that the mouthpiece and the airway will come straight into the front of the ocarina, like this, and the window for playing will be up here. So if you wanted to start to flatten out the top of that ocarina, that'll give us a place to install the voicing. So this piece is still very, very wet, and I would have to let it sit for quite a while before I work on it again. I think what I'll do is I'll lightly tent it in plastic and cover it up in my bin overnight. That way I can come back to it when it's stiffened up a little bit. I want to make sure that the mouthpiece is still reasonably wet though. So it's a good idea, instead of letting it sit right on your canvas board, to put a piece of plastic down and then put your cubby, or then put your bin on top of that. We don't want this really to dry out much. It just needs to sort of stiffen up before we do any voicing work tomorrow.